The Economist.
I'm Rosie Blore, and you're listening to The Weekend Intelligence. This week, we're doing something a bit different, sharing with you 2 special editions of Drum Tower, our sister show about China. Michael Kovrig was a Canadian diplomat when I first met him in Beijing in 2015. We chewed over various stories, and I remember talking to him about how difficult it was to understand a political system that was so hard to penetrate. Unfortunately, Michael got an unparalleled insight into that system. After leaving the diplomatic corps and joining an NGO, in 2018 he was detained by the Chinese authorities and ultimately held for over 1,000 days. Today, David Rennie interviews Michael Kovrig about that experience. It's an extraordinary story of time spent inside the Chinese Communist Party's security machine and a unique lens onto Xi Jinping's China.
In my years as a journalist in China, there's one evening that stands out. It was December 2018. The foreign community in Beijing was in shock.
There's now a report that a Canadian is being detained in China. We're talking about a former diplomat for this country. We have a picture of him for you right here. His name is Michael Kovrig. Now, he no longer works for...
A former Canadian diplomat turned researcher, Michael Kovrig, had just been snatched from the streets of the Chinese capital by secret police. Late that winter night, a friend of Kovrig's got in touch and asked me to join a few fellow foreign correspondents for a briefing from an eyewitness to his detention. It was late, and the night was polluted and cold. I cycled to one of the city's diplomatic compounds, a well-guarded cluster of concrete office buildings and apartments, off-limits to ordinary Chinese. It took us a while to decide on a safe place to meet. I remember walking around in the dark with a handful of colleagues. Finally, we ended up in the kitchen of a newspaper office, and there we met Kovrig's partner, someone many of us knew as a China researcher and analyst. It was an intensely Cold War-ish moment. We could have been in Moscow in the 1960s. And for that small band of journalists sitting there, sipping our late-night tea, this detention was more than a personal crisis for Michael Kovrig and his loved ones. It was more than a big news story. It was also our biggest fear, playing out in front of us. Foreigners in China live with the knowledge that somewhere out of sight, China's security machine is watching. Now, it had shown itself.
When it happened to me, as it happened to me, I had a very acute, sort of almost quiet-minded sense of living through my worst-case scenario.
Back in 2018, Kovrig's was a name I knew, but I'd never met him in person. Now, in 2024, he's talking publicly for the first time about his years in detention in China.
They pushed me into the SUV, and just as I was disappearing into it, I looked back, and my partner and I looked at each other, and I just tried to send her a signal that, take care of yourself, take care of our baby, get help. I will get out of this.
Kovrig's partner was almost 6 months pregnant.
They just shoved me into the back seat, handcuffed me, blindfolded me. Officers sat on either side of me. And if you've never been handcuffed in a situation, that kind of icy metallic feel of handcuffs closing around your wrists is a very disturbing sensation. Part of the horror of it is that it imposes on you a completely different identity. Right? We spend our lifetimes kind of developing a sense of who we are. Those handcuffs get slapped on you, and suddenly there's an implication that you're a wrongdoer.
Soon, Kovrig was accused of crimes against state security. In reality, he was a hostage, a Canadian citizen caught up in the crossfire of the China-US rivalry. His plight became a diplomatic incident that made headlines around the world.
Canada may now be caught up in the fight between China and Washington, a diplomatic dispute that could drag this country into the trade war between the two superpowers.
Kovrig's wife spoke to Global News about the 18 agonizing months he spent behind bars.
Coronavirus has taken a toll on 2 Canadian citizens stuck in a prison in China for the last 500 days.
It has been 1,000 days since Michael Spavor and Michael Kovrig were detained by the Chinese government.
In all, he spent 1,019 days in detention. But for Kovrig, each day was a struggle to endure.
The interrogator sitting at the desk, on that day he had a single piece of paper from which he read from in a monotone voice. 4 days ago, your partner gave birth to a baby girl. Mother and daughter are healthy. That's all I have for you today. He gets up and walks out and leaves me sitting in the chair for the rest of the morning, locked into it.
Now, on the 3rd anniversary of his release, Michael Kovrig has lessons to share. I'm David Rennie, the Economist geopolitics editor. And over the next 2 episodes of Drum Tower, I'll be talking with Michael Kovrig about his detention and what it tells us about the China of Xi Jinping. This is Drum Tower from The Economist. I'm sitting in a hotel in Canada, face to face with a man whose fate haunted every Western diplomat, researcher and journalist in Beijing. In person, Kovrig is tall, dark and intense, and he takes me back to the years that he worked as a diplomat at the Canadian Embassy in China from 2014 to 2016.
I'm a big city guy, so I found the energy and intensity and complexity of Beijing fascinating and very energizing. One of the most useful things that I did as a diplomat in terms of trying to get to know Chinese people, I joined a couple of wine appreciation societies. I like to go a lot to little music bars and jazz bars. But that's one thing that strikes you about Beijing also. For a city of its size, the sort of informal culture, right? The culture of the people there, music, other performances, entertainment, is really thin on the ground. But at least, in 2014, there was still a lot of fun and interesting things to do that way. It also had an interesting art scene. And I tried for diversity to try to get involved in those things, but also because those were good ways of meeting people and just immersing yourself in Chinese culture, partly because it was so hard to have meaningful conversations in official meetings.
In 2017, Kovrig took leave of absence from the Canadian Foreign Service. He wanted to keep working on China, so he joined the International Crisis Group, a Brussels-based conflict prevention organisation. He lived in Hong Kong, but he commuted into Beijing, where he'd stay in a modern part of the city near the embassy districts. He lived in a futuristic compound called Sanlitun Soho, shiny black and white skyscrapers designed by a Japanese architect.
And this was in the Sanlitun area, which is sort of one of the most modern, kind of commercial, gleaming parts of Beijing.
Kovrig found that even the layout of the city, with embassies and their own special districts far from the government headquarters, was like a system designed to keep foreigners from seeing too much.
Half the time, if you wanted to go see Chinese contacts you wanted to talk to, you had to fight your way through Beijing traffic and cross half the city and back. So that in itself, just logistics were exhausting in the city. The other is that it's a city that, where everything seems to be sort of too big for a normal human scale, right? But if you've ever walked into the Ministry of Public Security, you stand in front of it and you walk into that lobby, that very building essentially says to you, you are a bug in front of the state. The state is huge and mighty. You would dream to challenge the state, think again. The blocks in Beijing, from an urban planning perspective, are too long, right? Because everything is divided into these walled-off sort of xiaoqu. If you're trying to get from point A to point B walking, you've got very long blocks to cross.
Kovrig is not the only foreigner to feel impossibly small face to face with Chinese power. But he thought that he still had a role to play, that the situation was becoming so worrying that anything he could do to shed light on China was his duty.
The main reason that I took the job with Crisis Group, the timing was ideal for me. When I was finishing my diplomatic posting, it became existentially clear to me that we were heading into a world where, at best, we were going to have a very intense rivalry between China and the US and its allies. And at worst, we could have a major armed conflict in the Pacific in my lifetime. And I felt that given that there's a limited number of people who understand China, and particularly also understand those kinds of issues and topics, I had a responsibility that if I could do good work in an area, even if I'm just a tiny cog in a giant system, if I can do some constructive work to try to prevent a major war in the Pacific or small things becoming big problems, I should do that work. And so the Crisis Group advisor position was an opportunity to do that.
In 2018, the year that Michael Kovrig was detained, I was just beginning my second posting in China. For the Foreign Press Corps, even for foreign diplomats, working in China often felt like taking a calculated risk.
For all of us working in China at that time, if you understood China and you were aware of the arbitrariness of the system and the law, you always lived with a certain perennial fear that something you wrote or said or did, or that your government did, might be misperceived somehow, and you hoped you might at least be able to get off lightly, maybe with getting berated by the MFA or something, rather than actually having the men in black come and drag you away.
Kovrig was a citizen of Canada, a country that for a long time preferred not to see the risks or the dark sides of the world. Canada was an open, trade-focused country that wanted to be friends with every great power, including both China and America. But by 2018, with Donald Trump in the White House, it was getting harder for countries like Canada to wish geopolitics away. It was becoming a time to choose sides, whether Canada liked it or not. America was asking allies to help it push back against what it saw as the China threat. And China was ready to punish countries that lent their support to those American efforts. In Xi Jinping's China, the authorities are less and less tolerant of foreigners asking questions. Research that would be normal elsewhere can be called spying. Michael Kovrig's work involved the normal business of diplomacy, or journalism, making contacts, speaking to scholars, spotting business people with first-hand knowledge of what's happening out on the ground.
It's definitely not espionage, it's diplomatic reporting, pure and simple. I think the issue is that the Chinese have a selective definition of espionage, and if you look at their current 2023 counter-espionage law, they've essentially criminalized asking nosy questions.
Kovrig is clear about why his work was different from spying. Unlike diplomats, spies are tasked with stealing secrets, information they're not supposed to have, and they will bribe and coerce and blackmail to get what they need. At the International Crisis Group, he was trying to understand some of the most sensitive issues in Chinese foreign policy.
Some of the main issues I was looking at were things like the South China Sea disputes, tensions between China and Taiwan.
And he was also interested in understanding China's neighbour North Korea, a hermit kingdom and headache for the whole region.
The main thing that I was actually drawn into working on was not, in fact, China, but rather North Korea, because at that point in time, over the last couple of years, Kim Jong-un had been ramping up North Korea's missile testing and including nuclear testing, and was being increasingly menacing.
China's border region with North Korea is a tightly policed place. Diplomats and journalists travelling there often struggle to get a sense of what's going on. One contact, for many of them, was Michael Spavor, a Canadian entrepreneur who ran travel tours into North Korea. Kovrig first met Spavor when he was working his secondary role at the embassy as a vice consul, looking after the welfare of far-flung Canadian citizens. Spavor lived on the Chinese side of the North Korean border.
He liked to live there because it was a good place to run his tour business, and he didn't speak Chinese. The point being, my initial interest in him was simply like, oh, we have a Canadian living in a part of the country that is probably, not the safest place to be doing business. Let's keep tabs and, keep in touch with him, make sure he's doing okay.
Sometimes, when I think about the work of covering China as a journalist or researcher, I can see in my mind's eye a series of impenetrable black boxes, with foreign analysts peering at them from the outside. There's the black box of China's political system. There are other specific mysteries. Who owns this big Chinese company? Who really controls that technology? And then there's China's security machine, the blackest box of all. By the middle of 2018, Trump's trade war had stoked tensions with Xi Jinping's China, and the loudest arguments were centred on a particular Chinese technology company, Huawei.
Some of Canada's allies say China could use Huawei's technology to spy on the Canadian government, even spy on us. Last week, the Pentagon banned sales of Huawei phones on American military bases around the world. And FBI Director Christopher Wray had this to say.
We're deeply concerned about the risks of allowing any company or entity that is beholden to foreign governments that don't share our values. It provides...
Huawei had rapidly become the supplier of choice to telecoms giants around the world. The Trump administration wanted friends and allies to stop buying technology from Huawei. They accused the company of being controlled by the Communist Party, maybe even the People's Liberation Army.
Huawei.
Chinese media retorted that Huawei is a private company whose only offence is to sell equipment that is better and cheaper than the kit made by Western rivals.
Shows that lawmakers are concerned about Chinese companies in the U.S. telecom sector. Huawei said in a statement that the U.S. market presents unique challenges and it remains committed to the effort. Huawei said that privacy and security are always its first priorities. Huawei is the one...
American officials pointed to China's national security laws and argued that Huawei could be used as an arm of Chinese intelligence gathering. Huawei denied that. When operating in foreign markets, it said that the company would never, could never, hand over foreigners' data to Chinese spy services. Huawei insisted that it obeys local laws in each country, and those laws would forbid it from spying for China. The once publicity-shy company began sending out its best engineers as corporate lobbyists. The company's aim was to make trust into a technical engineering problem. Huawei's pitch to governments was, look inside our 5G box. See, there's no back door. But America was trying to convince allies that this was the wrong question. The question was a much simpler one. Why would you let a company from a country like China build something as vital to modern life as a 5G network? Then the US Department of Justice took a crowbar to the black box of Huawei. They decided to prosecute Meng Wanzhou, the company's CFO, and the daughter of its founder. She was arrested while changing planes in Vancouver under an extradition treaty that the Americans have with Canada.
Huawei's CFO has been arrested in Canada at the request of US authorities. Canadian officials say she was arrested on Saturday, the same day as China and the US signed a temporary trade war truce.
At the time, I did assess that there would be consequences because the Chinese tend to like retaliation in such cases. I didn't expect that they would take hostages, and I didn't expect they would take me a hostage in particular. First of all, because the source of the dispute was really with the United States. I actually speculated that, would they, for example, detain an American tech executive or something, and thought, well, that wouldn't make sense. That's just going to chill the business community on China. So unfortunately, I thought through some of that, but I underestimated, I think, their rashness and ruthlessness in prosecuting their things. And also, I think I didn't entirely think through adequately what China's objectives were in taking hostages there.
Michael Kovrig has thought again and again about his fateful decision to fly to Beijing just days after Meng Wanzhou's arrest in Canada.
I was in Hong Kong at the time, but I had a ticket to Beijing in a few days. So again, if you want to talk about sort of how human mind works, right, we tend to keep going with the default of what we're doing unless something pushes us to change it. I think if I hadn't had a ticket booked, I might have waited.
Meng Wanzhou is seen as tech royalty in China. Netizens sometimes call her Huawei Zhanggongzhu, the Princess of Huawei. Meng was one of Huawei's public faces around the world. Here she is, giving a presentation in Singapore a couple of months before her arrest.
I mentioned idealism and practicality. Both are important in R&D at Huawei. We look up at the stars and look into the future. We also keep our feet on the ground and do what we can with what is possible today.
American prosecutors called Meng something more sinister, an agent of China's geopolitical influence. Specifically, they accused her of misleading a bank about Huawei's business dealings with Iran. Huawei said it was unaware of any wrongdoing by Meng Wanzhou.
U.S. prosecutors say Meng used a shell company for Huawei's dealings with Iran, misleading banks into approving millions of dollars in transactions that violated sanctions.
For the Trump administration, this prosecution was a chance to shine a harsh light on Huawei and prove to the world that Chinese tech companies cannot be trusted. Learning that Meng Wanzhou would be on Canadian soil, the American Department of Justice asked Canada to arrest her and extradite her to the US. When President Donald Trump found out what had happened, he was reportedly angry. He told his national security advisor this was the equivalent of China arresting Ivanka Trump. And if Trump was cross, you could imagine that China's Communist Party leaders were furious.
The Chinese side has lodged stern representations and made clear our solemn position to the Canadian and the U.S. sides respectively on this matter. We demand that they immediately clarify the reason for the detention and release the detainee, and earnestly protect the legal and legitimate rights and interests of the person involved.
I actually did an interview with Al Jazeera about the Meng case on the 5th or 6th of December, just after the news broke. So I was also, like many analysts, scrambling to try to understand what happened and what the implications were, trying to get information from the Canadian government about how serious is this, what are the Chinese saying to you, but nobody in the Canadian government would talk to me about it. So it was a bit frustrating that way.
Straight after Meng Wanzhou's arrest, Chinese officials publicly warned that Canada would face serious consequences. Despite that threatening backdrop, Michael Kovrig flew to Beijing on an important personal mission. He needed to help his partner pack her belongings to move with him to Hong Kong. On December the 10th, Kovrig was putting the finishing touches to talking points for the president of Crisis Group, who was preparing a trip around Asia. After pressing send on the last email, he and his partner headed out for a late dinner. This was the beginning of a new life for them. They were going to live in Hong Kong together. They just booked a hotel for a Christmas holiday. And on their way back from dinner, they'd picked up some shopping and were carrying it back to their apartment in the Soho complex.
So I had grocery bags in my hands, and we walked back through the underground passage, came up a spiral staircase onto the plaza, and I've always wondered what would have happened if I had instead walked across the main plaza rather than coming up from below, and if I had seen the fact that there were over a dozen men in black standing outside the entrance of my apartment building there. But as it was, we popped out of this spiral staircase, and there they were, immediately surrounding us. These men in black with cameras on their uniforms, but no markings. A woman holds up a piece of paper with Chinese writing on it that I didn't have a chance to read because everything was happening too quickly, but apparently was a warrant for my arrest. I pulled up, I could see obviously this was not a very good situation, pulled out my phone trying to call maybe the Canadian embassy, call anybody who was going to quickly answer to let them know that I was in a situation. They grabbed my arms, they pulled the phone away from me, they dragged my partner, who was pregnant at the time, away from me. So that was one of my primary concerns. Like, hey, what are you doing? They effectively immobilized me and then forced me to walk towards a waiting set of black SUVs. And when you're in a situation like that, you immediately think it's a fight or flight instinct kicking in. There were far too many of them to even consider somehow fighting or scuffling with them. And I was also immediately mindful of the fact that really you want to get into a fight with security officers, even if you're completely innocent, you're going to be in even deeper trouble after that. So there wasn't much other option but complying with them.
Kovrig was pushed into one of the waiting SUVs. He was blindfolded and handcuffed.
So they drove off into the night. I couldn't see where we were going, but I could kind of peek around the blindfold a little bit to see the clock on the dashboard. And so I tried to keep track of time. I counted the minutes and tried to sort of figure out where the car was turning. And based on that, I was able to reckon that we headed into South Beijing, although I couldn't be sure because you go on these loops. We headed down the 3rd Ring Road and ended up about 45 minutes later into South Beijing. I hear the gate opening, I hear a lot of dogs barking, crunch of gravel, and then I feel that we've gone down into an underground parking garage. They took me upstairs, up an elevator from there, and sat me in an office and took off the blindfold.
Michael Kovrig was now inside the blackest box of all, China's secret security state.
And they had sat me in one of their standard interrogation chairs. It almost sort of feels like an adult version of a child's high chair. And it's that disempowering as well. They just simply fold a board of a sort of tray over your legs and then lock it into place so that you can't get out of the chair. And sitting at the desk was an older Chinese man, maybe in his late 50s or early 60s, very thick glasses, a translator or an interpreter standing next to him, and a couple of the uniformed officers there, but no badges or identifying marks.
Pinioned in that chair, he heard the charges against him and realized the terrible turn that his life had just taken.
I was still hoping that maybe this was just their very aggressive way of inviting me to drink tea. Many correspondents, maybe not you personally, right, will have been brought in at some point by the security services to have conversations about things. And my hope was this was just their way of inviting me to a conversation. But then they told me that night that you've been detained for questioning on suspicion of endangering China's national security. And at that point, I knew that my worst-case scenario was unfolding.
On that same day, a second Canadian, Michael Spavor, the entrepreneur who ran tours to North Korea, was also detained in the northern Chinese border city where he lived. News media would quickly call them the two Michaels, hostages held in retaliation for Canada's arrest of Meng Wanzhou. Meng Wanzhou eventually reached a deal with America's Department of Justice, avoiding prosecution. But while that deal was being negotiated, the two Michaels were held for almost 3 years. Throughout that time, Michael Kovrig made it his mission not just to resist, but to emerge a stronger and better person, and with a clearer understanding of China. That's next week. Thank you for listening to Drum Tower. Our editor is Poppy Sebag Montefiore. Alizé Jean-Baptiste, Jiahao Chen and Lucy Raw produced this episode. The executive producer is Hannah Mourinho. Sound design is by Weidong Lin. Drum Tower's music was composed by Jocelyn Tan.
Part 2 of David's interview with Michael Kovrig is available now in the Intelligence feed alongside this episode. You'll need to be a subscriber to listen to that and to catch all our superb reporting on China on the Drum Tower podcast every week. Subscribing is what makes our journalism possible, so thank you. Search Economist Podcast Plus for a free trial.